today on the podcast, we have a special guest who is a friend of Sarah and mine, and it's Jay Warner Wallace, also known to us as Jim. And we invited Jim on the show for this Christmas episode for a special reason. You might be thinking, why would you have an apologist on your Christmas episode? Well, Jim has come out with a new book called A Person of Interest: Why Jesus Still Matters in a World That Rejects the Bible. And Sarah and I were thinking about what we wanted to talk about for a Christmas episode, and why not talk about this idea that what we celebrate on Christmas actually happened. It's a historical event that Christianity claims is true, that this actually happened 2,000 years ago. Now, we don't claim it happened on December 25th, but that's the day we celebrate. Another thing that I was thinking about too is in one of our episodes with Christopher West that a lot of you listeners have listened to, and if you haven't, you need to go back and listen to that interview. But Christopher West kept saying to us, if Christmas is real, then then there were implications to that, right? And he must have said, Sarah, right, 4 or 5 times, if Christmas is real. So today we're talking to Jim about whether or not Christmas is real. Did Jesus really come? Is it reasonable to think that what we celebrate on Christmas Day is grounded in truth and grounded in reality? And if it is, I think this will just help to deepen our worship for this holiday that is coming. So if you don't know who Jay Warner Wallace is, he is a cold case homicide detective who became a Christian and became a pastor, and that's when I met him, and now has become an author, and he's written several books. And as I say, this newest book, Person of Interest, is my favorite out of all his books, although maybe it's just my favorite because I just read it, but I love all of Jim's books. But Jim is a dear friend. His wife, Susie, is a dear friend and a mentor to me. So, Jim, thank you so much for coming on and talking to Sarah and I today.
It's nice to hear when you write a book and someone says, oh, that book's your favorite, because you always kind of wonder, are you done writing books that are anyone's favorite? I mean, it'd be nice if there was, but so
maybe it's just the other ones were so bad. She's
yeah,
like,
exactly.
whoa, finally, here's
of
a favorite.
Of all the crummy books you've written, this is the least crummy. That's good.
Yeah,
exactly.
there you go.
I can live with that, I suppose. But also, when someone says that they are Susie is like a mentor, I always read that. I hear that as we're just old. Okay, like yes, I have these friends that are a lot older than us, and so there you go. That's about it. So that's how I feel sometimes. But I'm glad to be with you guys. This is an important topic, so I'm glad to be able to talk. You're right. This is a lot of folks. They will celebrate Christmas the same way they would celebrate other things they don't think are true, but they offer an opportunity for your family to get together. So even if it's not true, I'm still willing to celebrate it. And then you have a lot of Christians who will kind of doubt that, was Jesus really born on December 25th? Right? I mean, there's good reason in Scripture to kind of doubt that is the case. But again, is the event true, even if the date isn't the date of the actual event? So that's what we're trying to talk about. So
yeah, even if our American holiday is December 25th, we don't really make an apologetic for December 25th as much as we make an apologetic or a defense or a case for the historical event that happened and seemed to catapult the world into this whole different era.
Yeah, well, something happened for sure, and that's we call this the first century, the century in which Jesus was born, for a reason. It isn't the first century. It isn't the first century that people lived in, and it wasn't the first century that history was written about. So why are we calling this thing the first century? Because something happened that catalyzed, that really created something. Even if we said, okay, this is the common era, right? Like, what is it about this era, starting in the first century, that differentiates it from the other era? And so much of it is modernity. It's all the stuff that I actually don't think we'd even experience if it wasn't for Jesus and the worldview that he inaugurated. That worldview is so foundational to modernity that we often take it for granted, right? And that's one of the things I'm trying to do in this book is to show you. I want, first of all, people to realize how beautiful Jesus is. I write books because I'm geeked out about the topic. I don't really have anyone in mind. I'm not like, that's not really probably a good way to write a book. Usually people will say, you need to know who your audience is, and then you be true to you. But I don't really think about that. I just think about, here's what I'm interested in. And so if somebody else is interested in it, great. And if they aren't, it'll fail. But the point is really, if we're geeked out about Jesus, we're going to write about him probably.
Mm-hmm. Okay, before we get in too much deeper, for those of our listeners who actually don't know your story, Jim, are you able to tell it shortly? Because we have so much to talk to you about. But your story is so fascinating, how you came to Christ from being a cold case detective. Can you tell us about that?
It was Susie. We were together 18 years. We never talked about issues related to God or religion. It was never part of our conversation. And then we had kids, and then the conversation kind of shifted toward, well, should we like put our kids in some kind of preschool or some kind of a place where they could learn about, I think for me, I thought, well, you're talking about like learning moral truths. I didn't think that was necessary because I didn't have anybody growing up who was a Christian, and I thought I came out okay, right? I mean, of course, everyone thinks they come out okay, but I thought, well, if you want to do this, I'm fine with it. It doesn't have to be true. My dad's somebody who would go to church, not thinking it's true, but because he thinks it's good for the kids. And so he just kind of sees it, it's something you have to do because they're good for kids. And so that's what my view was. And that's why I went to church the first time with her. Although I did resist for a number of years. We were living here in South Orange County, and I didn't know much about church, especially about when I thought of church, I thought of like Catholicism, right? Because I didn't know anything about the history of Christianity or any of that stuff. It just wasn't on my radar. So I thought, well, there's a Catholic parish here in town. I thought we were going to probably end up over there. But we ended up at a huge megachurch where the pastor really understood that there were probably going to be unbelievers in the audience. And he said that Jesus was the smartest man who ever lived. And that provoked me to purchase a Bible. And I got it sitting back here on my shelf. It was just a pew Bible, just the kind of small margin. And I must have tore that thing to shreds just trying to examine what it was he thought was so smart about Jesus. And that's what started all of it for me. And I was somebody who knew, I knew how to investigate eyewitnesses. I had some sense of how to work events in the past. Remember, every crime is kind of locked into time. It's part of a timeline. If you're working unsolved murders, you're working cases that are sometimes 3 decades old, and you don't have any access to anybody who's still alive. So it's something you're kind of investigating history, even though it's modern history rather than ancient history. There's some of the same principles apply. And I chronicled half of it in Cold Case Christianity. I never thought I would write this book, but Zondervan kind of prompted me to look at the rest of it. So and it was because I knew this was going to be a much harder book to write, and so I really didn't want to.
Research.
Yeah, I didn't really want
because
I had when I was investigating this 20 years ago, looking at Christianity for the first time. I developed. I didn't like write down all the sources. I mean, once I was satisfied that I learned something, I would kind of put it in my head and move on to the next thing. Well, now I knew I had to go back and retrace all that and find the sources for it again. And I just put it off. I didn't really think I was ever going to write this book, but here we are.
So you and Susie, what you go into in the book, and I love how you weaved your story throughout the book. But for those of our listeners who don't know, you were a cop, a cold case homicide detective. So you're investigating murders that happened years ago, and the one you talk about in the book, there's like no evidence and no body. And so you're supposed to find a murderer when there's no body and no evidence, basically. So you have to start from scratch. And how this is, of course, the strategy you used in your Cold Case Christianity book, which I recommend to people all the time, but also in this book where just you trace more of your own journey of, okay, who is this Jesus guy and why does he matter? And you talk about in the book that you want to make a case for the historicity and the deity of Christ and help us to understand why Jesus matters. So before we dive into the book, talk a little bit about how you use your detective work when it came to this topic.
Right. And it wasn't like I was trying to think, it's a unique approach where I'm going to take a template. No, I just didn't know any other way to do it. So I've done a bunch of these no-body murders, and so I've kind of cobbled them together. This story of Tammy and Steve Hayes is probably like a 70% based on one case and 30% based on other cases. I kind of mix because, as it turns out, some of these folks get paroled. So it's always good to kind of cloak the case a little bit, right? In case they get out of jail and start reading your books, or they've been reading your books while they're in jail, waiting to get out. Anyway, so either way, but yeah, so this has been changed a little bit, some of the details, but they're very similar. No DA wants to work a no-body murder, because no-body murders are like where your husband kills a wife, or a wife kills a husband, or a business partner kills a business partner, and claims that person, had a fight, and they ran off, and never showed up again, and I don't know where they are. We just had one of these this year. If they hadn't found her body out in the middle of the wilderness, they wouldn't have known really if they had a case yet, or what kind of case. They had some suspicion. What do you do? Most DAs do not want to file no-body murders, because you got to make two claims to the jury. One, she's dead. I got to prove that. And then two, he did it. So it's a double whammy. So most of these DAs won't touch these cases. So what you do in front of a jury is you explain that, hey, if on the day she went missing and there's no body, there's no evidence, no one even took it as a murder, they took it as a missing person case. So there's no photographs of the crime scene, not a single piece of evidence in the property room. So how do you make a case like that? Well, you start from scratch and you ask yourself the question, if on the day of the murder, she was actually murdered and not just ran off, well, then a bomb went off. But bombs are always preceded by a fuse that burned toward the detonation of the bomb. And after the bomb explodes, well, you've got debris everywhere. So you make a case like this in front of a jury from the timeline, from the fuse and the fallout of the bomb explosion, tells you what happened on the day the bomb exploded. And so I took the same approach. Part of what I did with Jesus, look, if you're not interested in Scripture and you're not even willing to buy a Bible, well, it turns out there's enough information in the debris of the fallout of history, and you can look at the fuse and the fallout of history and make a case for Jesus, because you're going to get that Bible repeated to you in any number of nooks and crannies in popular culture, in human history, in a way that's surprising, shocking. And it really speaks to the historicity and deity of Jesus, because there's no other person in the history of persons who's had this kind of impact. And that's what the claim of the book. Imagine, okay, you've got a scenario in which every New Testament has been utterly destroyed by some evil regime in the future. Well, would that be enough to wipe Christianity from the surface of the planet? Actually, no. And everything you need to know about Jesus, the most robust restoration of the Jesus story, can be found in history, in the fuse and fallout of history. You're going to be stuck with Jesus of Nazareth no matter how you try to scrub him, because you're not going to be willing to scrub him from every place he exists today. And that's what the book is trying to do. Number one, show the amazing impact of Jesus. But number two, show that this impact still has his fingerprints on it, so you can reconstruct the story of Jesus. This is not true, by the way, for any fictional character in the history of fictional characters. You pick one you think is really, powerful, a powerful fictional character. If it's, I don't know, Luke Skywalker or Peter Pan or whoever you think you want to ask yourself, has that person had the impact on history that Jesus of Nazareth had? Remember, in the book, I'm talking about art, literature, music, education, science, world religions, and just to show you that no one has had this kind of collective impact. So if no fictional character in the history of fictional characters has ever had this kind of impact, it's reasonable to infer that Jesus is not a fictional character. But you're also going to discover that no other mortal living human being has had this kind of impact. And if that's the case, it's reasonable to infer that he's more than a living mortal human being. So there is a case to be made here for the historicity and deity of Jesus once you recognize the amazing ways that he's impacted history.
This is a great book to give to an unbeliever or a skeptic, because it's a fresh perspective, or even just a Christian who's wanting to deepen their understanding, because you're looking at it from a different angle, from fresh eyes. And one of my favorite parts is when you set up this, and I'm not going to go too detailed because I want you to go detailed, but when you set up how he fulfilled what the Greeks expected a deity to look like. And your illustration was so great. You had the crowd of Greeks over here, then you had a plus sign, and you have the crowd of Israelites, because then you go in and you list all the ways that he fulfilled the prophecies that the Israelites would have expected him to fulfill. And then you have an equal sign, you have Jesus there. I just love your illustration. But could you walk us through, maybe that's too big of a question to start with. Maybe we should just say, what do you mean by that with the Greeks? How did Jesus fulfill and become, like C.S. Lewis called, the true myth, the myth that actually happened?
That's funny. I was listening to a book that from a guy I really love who's written on all kinds of cultural issues, and he must have done I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 podcasts on his book, and some of them were like really long. Like he was on Joe Rogan for like 2.5 hours. Afterwards, I never bought the book. I never felt like I needed to buy the book because I had listened to so much about the book in podcasts that there was no point in buying it. But this book is entirely visual. So what Zondervan allowed me to do is spend 2 years creating the stage presentations for this book, and then presenting them so I can get the feedback I needed to know what is visually powerful, what is not. I built a lot of stuff that we don't use because it just didn't. I tried it. It wasn't as influential as I thought it was going to be. And Susie watched me build it in this room and thought, "You're crazy. What do you? This is like." I mean, you're building all these little things you're putting on the PowerPoint. Why are you, it's going to take days, weeks to build it for what's going to be a 10-second transitional image, but a lot of it is visual. So the book has over 400 illustrations. So a lot of what we're going to talk about, I think you need to see it. Because once you see it in the timeline, it goes, oh, yeah, that's powerful because it's hard to articulate with words alone. But let me just give you the flyover version of it. So it turns out that there's a number of ancient mythologies that exist in antiquity in what's called BC or BCE. During that period of time, everything from ancient Persians, Egyptians, Hittites, every culture has got its mythological stories about deity. It's interesting, though, that everyone believes there's a God, and they shape the God in very similar ways. And so you could argue, well, yeah, everyone's just borrowing, because you do see this, for example, between the Greeks and the Romans. Some of the Roman gods are just directly borrowed from the Greeks. But this cannot be said between ancient culture to culture, because not every culture will destroy and even know what those other people were worshiping. The Greeks, clearly the Romans knew who the Greeks were worshiping, but it's kind of a stretch to say that, the Persians were stealing their gods from other. So my point here is to say that while there is, of course, some borrowing, what I see is that there are common expectations, and these shape out in broad generalities. And I found 15, reading through all the ancient mythologies of the major mythological characters, I think there's like 15 of these common expectations, and that's really all they are. So for example, pretty much everyone thinks that their God can do a miracle. Well, duh. This is what you'd expect. If there's a God who has supernatural power, you'd expect him to be able to exercise that. So the fact that your God can perform miracles seems like I would expect that as a common feature. But I also see as a common feature for most, but not all, that the God who appears will appear in some miraculously unexpected way. Well, okay, I guess you could say, well, if I've got a supernatural God who can, why wouldn't I expect him to pop into the... And it's very different, though. Mithras pops out of the side of a mountain, leaving a hole. Some gods are born out of the hip or the thigh of another god. Jesus enters into the world born of a virgin. But to say that the commonality is true, the common expectation of ancients appears with... By the way, we even think of this in modern times. We have many of these common expectations even as moderns. The vast majority of people on planet Earth believe there is some kind of higher power. So I just made a list of all these common expectations. Now what I discovered is, of the ancients, all the way from, we don't care if we're talking about all the Egyptians through all whatever it is, every culture preceding Jesus, you will see that their mythologies have no more than about 10 of the 15 common expectations. No more than about 10. And some have as few as 6.
So you're saying, just for clarity, you're saying that each, like you listed out all the common traits from all the mythologies that you were researching, but you're saying that each particular one, they didn't have the all-encompassing.
Yeah, they don't have all of them. They might have anywhere from 6 to 10, and they're a different 6 to 10. So I kind of charted them all. You can see, that they don't always have the same 10, but they don't really have any more than 10, except you get to Jesus. Now, Jesus comes on the scene, and he actually embodies all 15 expectations from antiquity, even though each culture only has some of those expectations. Isn't it interesting that he embodies all of them? If he arrives at a time when all of these myths are being simultaneously worshipped, he could leverage the fact that he has all 15 common expectations personified, right? Because then, I always say it this way, that when the expected meets the expectations of the expector, you get a great response. And this is true all happiness really is based on expectation, right? If I think this is going to be a great movie, And I've heard all kinds of wonderful, it's the best movie you're going to see in 10 years. And you get there and it's like, it's okay. Well, now, because my expectation was so high, I have disappointment. But so again, when you meet expectations, you get a better response. And Jesus ends up meeting the expectations of all of the ancients. This is why Paul on Mars Hill says, you folks have a lot of expectation. You are a very religious people. And I see all kinds of tombs here, even one to the unknown God. Well, I'm here to tell you that what you've thought about, and he even cites poetry, from the minds of your poets that came this expectations of God, we actually saw with our own, and there's the difference. You all have a story handed down to you from antiquity, which was never presented to you as an eyewitness account. Yet we saw with our own eyes. We have an eyewitness account to compare to your mythologies. And it turns out that Jesus of Nazareth is everything you expected on steroids. In a way that you never, and that means though you'd have to arrive in that period of time when the most number of ancient mythologies are still being worshipped. Let's face it, a lot of the Greek mythologies were starting to wane. Egyptian mythologies were starting to wane. By the time they get in the middle of the Common Era, they're gone. You've got to show up in a period of time if you want to capture those expectations. And that just happens to be when Jesus shows up. And once you start overlapping these fuses, that's just one fuse. I call it the spiritual fuse. And I just illustrate it for you so you can see what that range is. It's about 400, I think more than that, years in which he can come and capture the most number of worshiping ancients. This is why you said, C.S. Lewis puts it this way, that the ancient myths, and when he uses that word myth, he doesn't mean false story. He means a narrative about deity. Well, he would say that those ancient myths are the myths about gods coming from the mind of poets and humans, whereas Jesus is the myth about God that comes from the true God of the universe that are grounded in what we call real things. So this is the difference. And this is what Paul is kind of saying on Mars Hill. You've got ideas about God. We saw God. And we want to show you who God really is. So I think that's what we're trying to capture in that one fuse.
Yeah, I love that part too. And just to clarify, the fuse part is the fuse and then the fallout that you talk about in your book. The fuse is the events that lead up to this event that happens. You as a detective use the illustration of a murder. So you look back at the fuse. So you're looking back at now all these things in history that led up to kind of this question that you were asking, you and Susie were both asking, why did Jesus come when he did? Because why didn't he come today? I think you mentioned, Susie saying like, why didn't he come now when we have the internet and he could have, been broadcast throughout the world? Like, why did he come when he did? And so yeah, the part about the myths, I loved how you kind of turned it on its head and said, no, we don't have to be afraid of, there's these mythological gods that seem to be similar to the story. You're saying, yes, they are similar, but they don't fulfill it. And Jesus fulfills all of, he is the one that it's like what everyone was expecting. He feels this great desire of all these peoples and all these ideas. I love that part.
Well, why would you be surprised, by the way, that when God, that humans created in the image of God would begin to think about the nature of God and would end up with similar expectations? We are all descended from the same couple. So, of course, we end up with similar thinking. Even the pagans have similar thinking to other groups, including the Jewish groups. So I think in the end, that's why, yeah, you're right. That's why they're similar, right? And this is why we're talking about as we scream up to Christmas. It's that Christmas is this time that we celebrate when something real happened, not the creation of another myth, but the embodiment of God entering into his creation and fulfilling the expectations of the ancient myth makers. And that's what Jesus does.
Yeah. Okay, I also love the part, Jim, as part of the fuse, part of the buildup of why would Jesus come when he did. You talk about the Roman Empire, which as a Christian, we have a negative view of the Roman Empire because they were persecuting the Jews. Of course, we're like, oh no, that was so bad. Why would Jesus come? And maybe someone who's skeptical would say, why would Jesus come and not free them from the Roman Empire? Well, you make a case in the book about all the good that actually came and how the Romans and all that they did through roads and all kind. I'll let you explain it, but how this really just led to the perfect time for Jesus to enter the scene.
Yeah, think about that for a second, right? Because it's interesting that God would use history, because even Paul says that Jesus comes in the fullness of time. Really? After culture has just utterly destroyed other cultures. The list of wars, if you look at the list of wars in history and antiquity leading up to the Roman Empire, it's pretty unbelievable. The number of entire people groups that were eliminated by one or the other over time. Yet, so can God use this kind of empire destruction and empire building repeatedly, the Egyptian Empire, the Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, and then finally the Roman Empire, to accomplish something big? And I think he does. Let's look at it this way. When you're looking at fuses that come to murders, the question is, okay, so before he does this murder, how do I know he's involved? Well, is there a tension rising? Is motive developing? Is there hostility? Is he starting an affair? Is he starting to move to get the equipment he's going to need to bury the body or to destroy the body later? Is he starting to think about how he's going to what kind of weapon is he going to use? These are things that you see if you go back and look at the history of this guy before she goes missing. You will see things that are like, that doesn't sound like the normal, they just had a little fight and she ran off. Doesn't make sense given all of this preparatory work that seems like it's geared towards something much more nefarious. Well, it turns out that there's a lot of elements of history leading up to the appearance of Jesus that are also similarly kind of coalescing toward an event. And one of those is the cultural fuse, in which it's all kinds of things in culture, not just the Roman culture, but all the cultures that precede that, for example, begin to develop technologies for writing. If Jesus comes when all we're using are cuneiforms or pictographs, it's going to be pretty hard to describe what he said on the Sermon on the Mount. You don't have enough literary ability yet to describe what Jesus really said. Now, again, you're only writing on stone and clay, so it's kind of hard to travel. But now once papyrus emerges, once the Etruscan alphabet emerges, once there's a Greek common language, once there are roads in place, once there's a postal service that's moving, these are elements of culture that, as they develop over time, allow someone like Paul in the first century to communicate the message of Jesus, traveling on roads that were not even available to Paul 200 years earlier. They were only available because infrastructure was now being built by the Roman Empire, because they were in a 200-year period of peace called the Pax Romana, in which we had relative stability within the empire, so that ideas now could travel safely when they couldn't before. Not only that, resources spent on war were now being shifted toward infrastructure. And they were building roads for what purpose? To get ready for the next war. So they were building roads they could push their military machines on. And that meant they couldn't make a lot of tight turns. So they built more bridges and tunnels to go through and over things than all kinds of other cultures. And eventually, all the roads do lead to Rome, and including the connection to all the ancient Persian roads, which were really good, and even to the Silk Road to China. Now you have a network of roads. So the message we call the gospel has legs that it didn't have before. As a matter of fact, if Jesus appears, if you just take that Pax Romana, that 200-year period of peace in which you now have a postal service, roads, an Etruscan alphabet, papyrus technology. By the way, the Etruscan alphabet gives you enough vowels that you can tell the difference between words like said and sod and sad. You to know the difference between these words, to be able to articulate clearly what Jesus is saying in the Sermon on the Mount. By the way, the Hebrews could do this as well, but they didn't have the kinds of reach that the Romans did. The Romans could reach they were the most powerful force on the planet. So they had reach that the Jews just didn't have. The Hebrew language couldn't travel like the Etruscan language, because it was being so much more in use, the Etruscan language, than other languages. My whole point is, if you just take that 200-year period of time called the Pax Romana and you lay it over, you have to kind of see it in the illustration in the book. If you overlay that against the spiritual fuse we talked about, and then you add to it the prophetic fuse of the Jewish prophecies, because Daniel says this Messiah is going to show up between the edict to reconstruct Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. That's a very narrow window. Well, Adam, if you overlap all those, I didn't expect to see what I saw. I didn't start with Jesus and work backwards. I started backwards and worked up to the first century. And that overlap gives you a red zone. And that's what we call these. I call them red zones because I got a friend from NFL Network. I never called them that when I first started, but there's a red zone television show on NFL Network. And the guy, Scott Hansen, who hosts it, is a really committed Christian guy who loves apologetics. And he reached out to me years ago after I wrote Cold Case, and we've been friends ever since. And so I called this the red zone on the timeline That red zone for Jesus falls between 29 BC and 70 AD. I want you to think about that. 29 BC and 70 AD, right in the middle of that period of time, is 33 years. And guess who's living in those 33 years? It's Jesus of Nazareth. That, to me, ought to tell us something about the precision with which God uses that fuse to prepare for something that, as Paul says, he's about to put at the fullness of time. In the fullness of time, he's going to come as his son, and he's going to come into our. Think about it. If that's what I love about the fallout too. Is remember you asked that question? When Susie asked that question, why doesn't he come now? Why doesn't he come now when we have television, have all these YouTube, we got all this stuff we could communicate? Well, I think there's a couple reasons why. Number one, do you trust anything you see on YouTube? I mean, do you trust anything you see on TV? Do you trust? Look, and you would say, well, I trust it if it comes from the source I trust. Well, but no one can agree on a source. We're so polarized that we only listen to the sources we trust, and we don't trust the other sources at all, and they don't trust anything that we're saying. So there's like a truly, the more information we have, the bigger trust problems we have. I think we are seeing the collapse of what we thought were neutral institutions. They're gone. So I don't know that would have been any better if it came on CNN or Fox or Newsmax or MSNBC than it would be. Here's the other thing, though. I learned this while I was researching the book. Let's say I do a YouTube video tomorrow, and let's say it gets 100,000 views. There will not be 100,000 people downloading the video. There'll be 100,000 views. Now, if I was to write and sell 100,000 books, that book will now be in 100,000 different geographic locations. So to turn off the video, I just have to kill the server, because no one's downloading the video to keep it in their local hard drive. And if they did, that MP4 would probably only be good as an MP4 for so long before we change the technology anyway. But if you put the message in writing and copy it, and it goes all over the world, it falls into nooks and crannies that are almost impossible to identify, let alone destroy. If you want historical lasting information, you really do need to make sure that it's geographically located in one way or another. And that's the beauty of the Jesus story. It comes at a time when we can make copy after copy after copy, when people are writing about Jesus, reciting the verses they've learned from Scripture in their personal notes, letters, journals. There are now bazillions of geographic locations where the Jesus story resides. And I'm not sure that would have been the case if the primary way to communicate Jesus was absolutely purely digital. So I think there's a couple of reasons why Jesus comes when he wants. But technology, I don't think that technology was too primitive. It might have been just exactly because it's geographically dependent. And that's why I think it's exactly the right kind of technology to use to communicate the truth about the Savior.
And I love the part about the Romans, everything you're saying, Jim. And then I had never thought about till I read in your book about the Romans being religiously tolerant. They were kind of like, because they controlled so much of the world that they didn't go in and say, hey, you can't have your own gods. It was like, yeah, do whatever you want, but you got to pay taxes to us and, give Caesar his due, yada, yada.
Yeah, and at least initially they were tolerant of somebody who would have their own, rather than come in and just obliterate everyone's gods and systems. They would as long as you accepted the Roman pantheon of gods, and that's where ultimately, so that allowed Christianity to get a start. Ultimately, though, it started to have there's a rub, right? Because we're not going to bend our knee also to the Roman gods. But it took a while for them to figure that out. That was where this was headed.
Exactly. And I had never thought about that. Yeah. And I loved that. Oh, that was actually, the timing was perfect because it allowed Christianity to go and spread. And then we know the history of the church is actually persecution doesn't stops Christianity from spreading. It actually seems to light a fire and just have it spread even more. But I had just never, again, it was like you took one of those things that I knew and turned it on its head for me. And I thought, oh, wow, that's exactly right. That it actually, God used kind of a bad thing, the Romans building roads for their armor, and he used it for, I can send out all of my followers, and they have all these roads to make their way around the world. So good and interesting. Okay, so we want to talk more about the fallout, which is in your book, kind of the second part of you go through the fuse, and then the fallout is, okay, now Jesus has come, and this is how it's affected the world. So we're going to have you on for another little extra episode to do that. So catch our next episode with Jim, where we talk about the fallout from Jesus' life on earth.